Okay, so let's look at an example. Um, so just to remind you, this is another paper of mine, or actually the same paper of mine we've been using as an example. Um, this is getting at the idea of word familiarity, and when you feel like you recognize a word, what letters are more important to that? So what we did was we had people trying to get this idea that first and last letters are more important than interior letters. So for example, if you study this fragment of swallow with the first and last letters, does that versus you study this one with the interior letters, does that mean the word swallow is going to feel more familiar than the word vaccine, because first and last letters are more important than interior letters. So we did find what we predicted. So here's what the discussion looked like. It's not totally finished, but this is kind of, most of it. So in two experiments, we found that first and last letters seem to carry more weight in the computation of familiarity than do interior letters. So that's kind of recapping the results, and also what does that tell us? Well, this suggests that the feature matching process that generates familiarity is not only a matter of the amount of letter overlap, specific letters that overlap also matter in the computation of familiarity. So first and last letters are more important in terms of word recognition. That's the implication. Another implication, our results also build on the linguistic literature discussed earlier. Our work has shown something especially important about first and last letters. However, all the tasks described involved short-term speed of processing. So we're kind of building on this literature here where, for example, if you flash a word or a letter string really quickly, people have an easier time getting the first and last letters than they do any of the interior letters. That's kind of what we used for inspiration here. All those tasks, like the one I just mentioned, relate to speed. So it's like, how fast can you read a word? How fast can you, or given a limited amount of time, which letters in a word can you pick out? And it's always the first and last letters. So that's another point I'm bringing up here as a novelty. All the tasks described involve short-term speed of processing. Our results are the first to demonstrate the increased importance of first and last letters in long-term memory. Although not the focus of the experiment, identification of words were higher for first and last letter fragments than interior letter fragments. This is further evidence that the first and last letter advantage is not specific to the speed-oriented task discussed earlier. So just what that means is when you give people these fragments and they try and solve them, that's not really the main point of the study, but they have an easier time solving something like this than this. So if the fragment contains the first and last letters, they have an easier time solving it. Okay. So again, just want to emphasize here, much like the introduction, the thing that should be crystal clear is how your experiment is novel and why it's important, right? So that's, when it comes to your final assignments, that's going to be worth a lot establishing, and it doesn't have to be a big advancement, but it does have to be crystal clear, or if you want a good mark, it has to be clear about what is the novelty here. I notice this should kind of, you can go back and watch my introduction lecture again, but your discussion should also kind of parallel your introduction, right? So the points you bring up, kind of go back to them, and does it, what we argued in the introduction, did our experiment support that, right? This is just a future direction I brought up. So one thing we did here was we had people study these fragments in experiment 1 and these fragments in experiment 2. And one thing I noticed was that in this one, raindrop, you have two letters next to it, two pairs of letters next to each other. So the R and the A are next to each other. The O and the P are next to each other. In this condition, there's only one pair of adjacent or connected letters, the IR, right? So one thing that got me thinking was, could that be a confound here? Is the fact that this condition has two adjacent letter pairs, this only has one. Is that an issue? So that's why we went with these, where now you only have two adjacent pairs in both conditions. And actually ran a separate experiment finding that adjacency does seem to also matter. And it suggests that there's letter association and word familiarity, but worry about that. So that's something I bring up as a future direction. So we did actually find when the adjacency factor wasn't involved, that there was there's a slightly bigger effect here than here. And that would suggest that maybe adjacency does matter when it comes to familiarity. So that's something worth bringing up. It's worth noting that experiment 1 and experiment 2 seem to show different effect sizes. There could be several explanations to this. It could be, I was still working on this section, so there's another reason, but bottom line is maybe this issue of association between letters, this issue of adjacency, also matters in familiarity. That's not a question we directly investigated, but it is a future direction that kind of builds on this because it, again, closely relates to the findings of this paper. Another future direction, it's just another thing to note here. Kind of how long different sections are just depends on your paper. So, I mean, this probably won't be the case for you, but let's say you had several experiments, like I have one paper that has like 5 experiments and they have like several analyses each. You know, your kind of recapping of the results might be like 2 pages, right? Or it might be a paragraph if it's pretty straightforward. If you're kind of resolving an existing debate, maybe the future directions section could be pretty short or almost non-existent. My point is just that, on the other hand, if you're discovering something totally new, like this paper is quite novel, maybe your future direction section is going to be longer. So bottom line is just the kind of the length of these different parts is going to depend heavily on the nature of your research. Okay, so another question for future research to investigate, again, bring this up because it's really closely related to what we found here. Is it actually the first letter or the first and last letter that carry more weight in the computation of familiarity? Typically, and then kind of explanation for why that is. Typically, both the first and last letter are especially important in language. So, again, I'm still working on this part, but just what I'm saying here is that in some tasks, like reading, both first and last letters are really especially important. Other tasks, like say flashing a word briefly and trying to spot the letters, in like half a second, it's more so the first letter than the last letter. So that's kind of because we're building on that research. In this paper, we just look at first and last letters together. So kind of a logical next step would be, is it the first and last letter, or is it just one of them? Is it maybe just the first letter? And then because there's kind of evidence for both explanations. Which of these findings is a direction for future research? So again, just focusing on stuff really closely related to what we investigated. And then kind of the final statement. In summary, our results suggest that familiarity is not only a matter of features matching or not matching the test group, but the location of the features also matters. However, there could be other types of features that carry more weight and others in word familiarity, as well as other stimuli. Through our experiments and future experiments, we expect to better understand how the curious sensation of familiarity is generated. So that's kind of all the stuff I'm looking for. So again, what are these results? Recap them quickly. What do they tell us? I could probably have a little more in a recap here. What do these results tell us in terms of actual theory or practice? Are there, limitations if necessary? Again, limitations is kind of, I don't really have anything on that here just because it's a pretty straightforward experiment. This is where, like I said, I feel a little awkward writing a rubric for this particular assignment because limitations might depend, but I guess you could kind of consider a limitation or an alternative explanation of, is it the first letter or the first and last letter? Again, limitations might be very different depending on your paper. So like lots of examples we gave, maybe the materials or the tasks is not realistic. Maybe this sample is not representative, stuff like that. And then just kind of a final note and remind us why it's important. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Oh, and just a side note, the introduction is definitely always the hardest section. Kind of mentioned before, methods is pretty straightforward. Results, I'm willing to help you as much as you want. As long as you do the formatting right, no reason you shouldn't do. You're perfect there. The introduction is the hardest, and then the discussion is a little bit, I'd say probably second hardest. Well, yeah, probably second hardest. But definitely a big step down from the introduction. A lot of it, especially with your experiments, will just be kind of identifying reasons why your experiment didn't work. That's not an insult. It's just kind of reality. A lot of experiments don't work, and they take a lot of fiddling and tweaking. And you should have lots of reasons why. Maybe it's another factor. Maybe it's running it online caused problems somehow. So just a word of encouragement, and then also the abstract is usually, especially for your final papers, is not hard at all. Pretty much everyone gets near perfect on that. The abstract is a lot easier to write when it comes to your paper, because you've kind of seen the whole thing, seen all the sections. You kind of know what's important, what's not important. Whereas in the first assignment, you're kind of, just imagining it. You don't actually get to see the introduction, discussion, and all that. So anyways, and discussion also is easier because you've had a little bit of practice. Hopefully if you've been reading my feedback, you won't lose points for APA stuff or anything like that. So anyways, that's just a little word of encouragement. So I will talk to you later then.